We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 204 for December 16th, 2020. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about where and sometimes more importantly, why we dig where we dig. So sharpen your shovel because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Bill in California.
Good afternoon.
And Heather, also in California.
Hi, everyone.
And Stephen in Calgary.
Still not in California. Hi.
Still not in California. I mean, everybody's ended up being on the East Coast, on the West Coast, sorry, except for you, Stephen. That's why I had to come all the way over here to North Carolina. That's where I'm at right now, so we could just get our diversity back.
What part of North Carolina are you in?
Someone with an Easterner perspective.
That's right. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina until January 8th, if anybody's listening to this in real time, January 8th, 2021. And then we're off to Florida for about a month and a half. And then who knows from there, probably staying on the East Coast until summertime and then back to the West.
I love North Carolina.
I do too,
yeah,
especially
It's
Charlotte.
nice in the winter.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's nice in the winter because, the winter's nice. The humidity's not very strong. And honestly, growing up somewhere with evergreen trees from a CRM perspective, the forests over in the Pacific Northwest, Bill, as you know, are always dense. I don't care what time of year it is. It's hard to crash through those forests. But crashing through a forest with a shovel and a screen in North and South Carolina is pretty awesome because the briars are dead. There's very little ground clutter in most areas. And you can just crash through the forest and see for miles. And I just kind of love that kind of environment. In the summertime, it's absolute trash, but in the winter, it's really nice.
I have some relatives that live in Elizabeth City, and I've thought before about going, because now I can see from my house the Pacific Ocean, so it'd be sweet to drive all the way, because from Elizabeth City, you can almost see the Atlantic Ocean, drive all the way across.
Nice.
I think it always seems like it'd be an excellent idea, but I know it would turn out like one of those National Lampoon's vacations where...
Right.
I'm staggering through the desert somehow.
There you go. Well, I've dug thousands of shovel tests in the Carolinas, possibly tens of thousands. I didn't stop to count, but some days down on the coastal plain, we would get 70 to 100 shovel tests in a day because there was very little soil stratigraphy. So, and they're really only concerned with separating things by soil type, not by level in many of the projects. And to be honest, I'm not sure what the reasoning behind that was. So we didn't stop at 10 centimeters, count up our ceramics, which is mostly what we found. We just kept on digging. And typically you would dig as deep as your shovel would take it, or you hit water. And on the coastal plain, sometimes that was, 80 to 90 centimeters, depending on how deep you could get your shovel. And sometimes you did hit water if you were really out on the coastal plain, out near the coast. But it was all one level stratigraphically. And so we would just dump everything in the screen, lift up the screen. And if the soil was dry, you were left with a pile of ceramics. And it was kind of a cool thing. But how did we know where to dig? How do we know where we were going to get all that stuff? Well, that is the subject of today's episode. I know I saw this article, but I didn't dive into it as much as Bill did. So Bill, I'm going to let you introduce it, but we'll have a link to this article that we're going to discuss here in the show notes. It is from phys.org, and it's The Conversation. You guys may have heard of The Conversation. It's it's kind of like an editorial sort of thing, honestly. And this is under the subject of archaeology and fossils, but it's called How Do Archaeologists Know Where to Dig? By Gabriel Roble and Stacey Camp, and it was published on December 4th, 2020. So, Bill, why don't you summarize this article for us, and then we'll talk about it.
Yeah, it's an article I've been seeing for the last couple of days, maybe even a week, going around social media. I saw it on Twitter, but I mainly saw it on Facebook. It's a short article that's just kind of an introduction to the context clues and the other background data that we use to try and figure out where to dig. And the two people who wrote the article, I don't know who Gabriel Roble is, but Stacey Camp is a friend and someone I know who's a historical archaeologist. She used to be a professor at the University of Idaho after I went there. I just saw on Friday, which is the Friday the 4th of December. I saw a great talk that she gave on identifying Japanese ceramics and doing archaeology at internment camps. You know, in the talk, she discussed some of the data and kind of clues that she used to discover where to excavate at the Kuski internment camp in Idaho. But she also talked kind of extensively about going back through old collections that were at museums that have been gained through, you know, collectors, but also other projects where they weren't fully cataloged, and then recataloging specifically the Japanese artifacts based on the new artifact names that we use that are derived from the actual Japanese names for vessels and artifacts. So it's kind of a modernizing effort. But, you know, it was pretty clear. It's pretty clear in this article that, you know, folks are using LiDAR to try to identify things in Mesoamerica and then analyzing just surface scatter. She uses an example of looking at the distribution and the kinds of items that are found at tailgating there at the University of Idaho's football stadium parking lot. That's kind of an example of, you know, looking at things that are on the surface and then maybe trying to figure out what you can figure out from those kinds of artifacts and make some kind of conclusions on the kind of people who were there. So it's a pretty great, just a sweet article. If you're an archaeologist and you're starting out and your parents are asking you why in the world, like, what is this or whatever, just send this on. And it shows, you know, it's in very basic terms that many people can understand. When we were talking about that before we started recording, if you're doing cultural resources, you have a completely different reason, you know, why, how do archaeologists know where to dig? If you're doing cultural resources, you have a project area. And it would be amazing to go where we already have 50 years of information about, you know, colonial Williamsburg and excavate right in this area, which they do if you're actually an archaeologist for colonial Williamsburg. It'd be sweet to go dig right where you already know there's a bunch of stuff. But we have a project area that maybe takes us to coastal Carolina or, you know, the middle of nowhere in Nevada or, you know, all kinds of other places, digging through an entire city's worth of fill in Seattle or something like that. I mean, the reason where we're digging is dictated by the project, the, you know, parameters of our scope of work and what we're supposed to be doing. But also this article doesn't do a very good job of talking about the reasons why we would even excavate. You know, when do we know it's time to excavate? How do we know where to go? We have a project area, but also CRM archaeologists have some pretty clear parameters on when we would even excavate. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about here today.
I think part of the why, or I guess part of the where, is illustrated in the example I was giving at the beginning of this segment where, you know, I said I've done projects out here where we've dug, you know, thousands of shovel tests. And I remember one in particular that I was thinking of with that example of the, you know, dump a whole shovel test worth of soil into a screen and pick it up and find ceramics. That was out near Wilmington, North Carolina, off the Cape Fear River. And I can say all that now because it's a housing development and a golf course. So good luck. But we were out there, and I think the plan, because, you know, you have a statistical plan first, right? And in this state, they said you're going to dig a 30 centimeter round shovel test down to as deep as you can get with your shovel, or until you hit water or bedrock. Well, you're not going to hit bedrock on the coastal plain. It just doesn't happen, because you're not going to be deep enough. But you could hit water. You know, you could just have your unit fill up with water and then you're basically done. But the where, because this was a super good example, because back west, and Bill, you know, Heather, you guys know this, back west, I mean, we could be doing pedestrian survey in areas that never get any soil deposition, right? Because you're up in the high desert or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so we look for stuff on the surface. But back east here, I saw all, regardless of what you call the phases of archaeology, from recon to intensive investigation to full-scale block excavation, we can just call them phase 1, 2, and 3 for the purposes of this discussion. But I know that there's different numberings and sub-numberings and things like that out there. But we would do 2,000 shovel tests, and then we would take the findings from those shovel tests, because when we had a positive, you know, you do what they call the cruciform delineation, where if you're 30 meters apart, well, now you dig a shovel test at 15 meters between your last two, your positive and your last negative. And then if that one's positive, you do between that positive and the last negative, and you take it all the way down to about 5 meters, depending on your methodology. Things could change, but you basically are looking for densities, because the fact is humans did a lot of stuff together, right? So, and we're not necessarily looking for the one-off site from an individual. We're always looking for human occupations. We record one-off stuff. That's why we record two flake lithic scatters or a single point in the Great Basin of Nevada, because we're not going to pass that up just because it wasn't big enough, right? It wasn't enough. But what we're looking for is occupation, and we're looking for longer term, occupations for that, for lack of a better way to say that. And that was so cool out here in the Carolinas digging that way, because we do phase 1, we'd just do 30-meter shovel tests. Phase 2, we'd come and do like a 5-meter grid on top of a high density portion. And phase 3 is we start opening it up and chasing features. And that's basically all 3 phases of archaeology right here. And we did that out here in the Carolinas. Heather.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, number one, first of all, the project site, where, why are we digging? So, are we digging because we know something is there? There's already a site that's been established there. Typically, if you do a phase 1 and you're doing a pedestrian survey, I mean, it depends. I'm sure it's different states, but in California, if you do a phase 1, which is a pedestrian survey, you walk, you do not see anything, and you don't have any, let's say, there aren't sites around the area, significant sites around the area, or a significant amount of sites around the area that would point to a potential site in your project area, you're generally going to stop right there. You're not going to continue and dig. The second step is what we call an extended phase 1, or let's say you find something, you find some material on the ground, and now you're looking for absence of presence. And so, obviously that changes how you dig. So now you have the absence of presence, you find something, and just like you said, you have, this, you just kind of try to walk it back until you get to a point where you have somewhat of a boundary. And then the next step is, as far as CRM, when it comes to academia, I think, now you have a site and you're going to work with that site. As CRM professionals, we're not always going to dig, because now it's up to the client to decide whether or not they even want to go down that road. Not to say that if they don't want to dig, they can just go ahead and do whatever they want. Obviously not. They have to, if they decide that this is not something, Pandora's box, they want to open, they move on and don't build in that area or whatnot. And then,
I mean, a single small excavation could cost 3 times the amount the entire survey cost. That's just how it is.
Mm-hmm.
I recently had a project where we did a really large scale extended phase 1 with trenches and backhoe trenches. And there was over 100 that we did. There were some shovel test pits depending on the location of the unit that we had to do. If a backhoe couldn't make it, it was too steep, we did a shovel test pit, or for other reasons. But for the most part, there were backhoe trenches, and we were able to gather enough information to actually say we had a significant, that this, the evaluation, we could actually move from an extended phase 1, and we had enough information to say this was an eligible site. It was a significant site. And we had a peer reviewer that really wanted to push the fact that we needed to go ahead and do a phase 2 as well. And, I think that right, as far as CRM, is a really good example of when sometimes not digging is the right thing to do. And why is that? First of all, we've gotten the information that we needed. And this would be this is perfect Tom King territory here. The idea that we have to go 1, 2, 3, and we cannot pass, 2. We had to do each step. And that's a problem, because first of all, if we have a determination of significant, this is a site that, number one, needs to be preserved, right? So for us, if we know we have the information that we need to actually determine that this is a significant site or eligible, then why are we going to continue to expose it to disturbance through further excavation when we don't even know if, let's say, the project's going to be approved? So I think that's one example as far as CRM is why, when, how, do we test? Sometimes the best course of action is not to continue to test, even though as much as we'd love to get more information, it's not the right thing to do.
Right.
Yeah, I also feel like I agree, that I don't know if I've ever seen where we found a site that was recommended eligible to the National Register that we also recommended that you excavate it. I think that avoidance is always in the recommendations. It's always, we recommend that the project not cause adverse impacts. And then right after that, you will say something like, if adverse impacts cannot be avoided, then, here's the treatment, you should figure out a treatment plan, you should figure out a data recovery. And whether it was extensive phase 1 or phase 2, that was always kind of the, avoid the site, please don't destroy it. That was always the recommendation, even though we knew a lot of times there was no way they could not do they could avoid it.
Yeah.
But then
Excavations are at
Yeah.
artifacts. They are, I mean, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
learn that in Archaeology 101. So
Yeah, I hope so. If you didn't learn that right now, Heather told you. Now you know. The other thing too about academic archaeology, there's a whole bunch of other stuff on when you should excavate as well, right? And I think that sometimes students are being given this guidance that they always must excavate for their dissertation. I know I really felt the pressure, and it was. I think maybe even some of the professors were even like, well, you're not going to get a PhD from here if you don't excavate a site. I mean, I don't know if they said it in so much words, because there's other graduate students who were bucking that trend and were using collections or old data or, CRM projects for their project. They weren't going to go and excavate a new site, but it just seemed like me and many other people, and I also piggybacked on another, professor's project for my master's too, but it seemed like they really wanted me to do something completely new and original. And I was doing it in a place that was about to be, constructed upon anyway. So in a lot of ways, it was kind of a CRM thing, even though I got my dissertation out of it. I just feel like there's a lot of pressure that you will dig if you're in academia. And I don't know. I mean, even the authors of the article, I know one of them, like I mentioned, spend significant time working with old collections. They're not just excavating every single time they can, but I do know a lot of other colleagues and professors, they don't skip a beat. If there's a chance to dig, they're just going to go do it, whether they can curate, whether it's the same site they've been going to for 17 years, it doesn't matter. They're just going to excavate every single time they can. And I wonder when that's going to change.
Well, I actually think, and we can talk about this on the other side of the break, but there's some changes that are going on in California as far as curation of artifacts that I think is really going to change the approach of dissertation and the stressor on an excavation itself. And it really doesn't make sense numbers wise, because let's see, if you have every single dissertation, every single PhD student that is forced to dig, where's all the specialists? Where's all the work, let's say you talk about all the artifact analysis. Where is that coming? There's a PhD student can't do every single aspect of that, right?
No, that's what they are asking. That you will excavate a bunch of artifacts. You will do a bunch of artifact analysis. You will do reporting. You will do a bunch of carbon-14 dates. You'll do all kinds of other special analyses, right? Like you have 6 years, you're going to excavate and you're going to try to do what a CRM company does by yourself.
Yeah. I've read a lot of dissertations, and I have typically the dissertations that I read, they focus on one type of analysis or a few different types of analysis, especially if you have a really rich site, how in the world are you going to go through 50,000 fragments of faunal material along with everything else that went along with that site? It's just,
I don't know, Heather. It doesn't end up being done. It doesn't get done.
That's why we have curation facilities chock full of unworked material. It's irresponsible.
All right. Well, hey, speaking of irresponsible, we've gone way too long on this segment. No, I'm just kidding. Let's end here, and we'll come back on the other side and figure out where to dig even more into this topic. Oh my God, that was bad. All right. We'll see you guys in a minute. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. Welcome back to the CRM Arc Podcast, episode 204. And we are talking about an article that's linked in the show notes. So go check that out at arcpodnet.com/CRM Arc Podcast /204. And the article is basically called How Do Archaeologists Know Where to Dig? And that's what we're talking about. But, you know, Heather and Bill, you were just talking about the somewhat unstated mandate, sometimes explicitly stated mandate that a grad student has to dig, right? Kind of giving them that thought that, well, I have to do something like this to, you know, further my career, because that's kind of how you're starting the career, is by doing something like that. And, you know, well, I don't necessarily agree with that. And I think Heather doesn't either, because neither of us went that route. I think I heard Heather say, like, I worked with an older collection that was dug up by a university student on basically a CRM project before they started calling it CRM. And it just was never analyzed. And so I basically wrote a site report for it. Now, I didn't do that out of any ethical sense or something by my professors. I did that because it was a 1-year master's degree program, and there's simply no time to do anything. Yeah. So the idea behind the program, and one of the caveats to the program, is you either come with a data set or agree to work with one of the data sets they have, because they have a bunch. So that was the idea there. But here's the thing too. You know, I came into that program with a lot of, well, I guess more than zero CRM experience. I've been doing CRM for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years at that point. I guess 5 years at that point. So I came in with experience in multiple phases of archaeology and across the country, and that's one thing. But if you go from high school to your undergrad to a master's degree, which is relatively common out here on the East Coast, which is, again, one reason I wanted to get my master's degrees. I was tired of working for people who had never been in the field. And I was like, man, I need to get a master's degree if this is all going to change. So the question still remains, though, if you don't learn as much as you possibly can, which, I mean, that includes excavation, and the best time to do that is, you know, one of the best times to do that is when you're getting your master's or PhD, is go do that, because it teaches you those skills. Do you think that's not the reason behind it? Not just that there's some weird mandate to go dig everything up in the world, but it's like, you need to learn these skills and they're foundational.
That's fine, but it's not like, especially PhD students, it's not like they're actually out there with their major professor doing it, right? I mean, we're talking about sending unskilled people. Yeah. That, in your case, you had a couple of years of CRM, but in a lot of cases, there's zero CRM, or, a couple of summers, or maybe 5 months total of CRM. And so, you're sending an individual out there that's got borderline no experience, that has spent, a bunch of time looking at theory, and then a whole bunch of time reading books specifically about one site. So we're not talking about someone who's had many experiences on a lot of different sites. We're talking most of the time about someone who has just is set out there, right? And in some cases, in the best of all worlds, you will have someone who's done a little bit of CRM that's working with a huge group of professors on a site, and they're choosing something that they're going to use for their PhD or their master's, right? Because then you would have 4 or 5 individuals that have a whole bunch of different experiences, that have been in a lot of different sites, that are all professors, that are all working on this thing for the research questions that are, inherent to the project. That then, the student is working with this group of individuals, and they can push ideas around on, a whole bunch of different minds. And, it's not just them alone looking at this, archaeological feature. There's 3 or 4 people who have maybe seen other things at other sites, and maybe they have some other things to contribute, right? So, like, best case scenario, you'd have someone working on an organized project. And whether that's an artifact analysis too, if there's a collection and there's no professor that even has any idea what's going on here, and you take a student who's just read a book on how to catalog artifacts and they set to work, they're not going to get the same amount of learning out of that experience as if there's someone who's, cataloged artifacts or has worked with that collection, or, all I'm saying is there's a lot of pressure to do excavation, but there's not a lot of pressure from universities to make sure that that student is going with a skilled group of individuals in the vetting. Because at the end of the day, you write a dissertation and you did it all yourself, homemade, and you just went straight from cradle to PhD with no experience and wrote a dissertation. That thing's going to get evaluated the same as you were part of a top-notch group of international scholars working on the site, and you've spent 4 or 5 years working with this great group of folks that have taught you to look at this thing in a lot of different ways, because they're just going to hand it in. And the university is saying, does it have the right check marks? Have you passed the right exams? Have you paid for your dissertation? Have you done this? Have you done that? And then the people on your committee, a lot of times, if they weren't on the project, they're like, okay, well, it looks like it passes muster. Sweet. Looks like you've done all the things. Here you go. You get a PhD.
Well, I think, to kind of flip it around rather than the expectations of schools, that in a lot of cases, I've seen employers who, definitely want that out of their grad students because they want to have that level of practical expertise, without actually having to provide or acknowledge the idea that, really a lot of the excavation experience and artifact analysis experience and cataloging and whatnot, that's all on the job experience, right? And we all get that by working those 5 years like Chris did before he went on for his graduate program, or we talk about, just because you have a grad degree doesn't automatically make you the boss, right? It's like if you went straight through and got your doctorate and you went out and, to work on a field crew, congratulations, you're on the field crew. That because that's reflects the amount of experience, and maybe you'll advance faster. But that ties into, I've seen a lot of expectations from employers that what they want out of people who've gotten their grad degree is to have done excavations and artifact analysis in a very nuts and bolts sort of project, right? Rather than a theoretical one or one that, addresses a very specific research question. They want people to go out there and do essentially some sort of documentation project, because that's what gives them that experience. And it's well, no, why don't you hire them and train them?
From my experience, yes, I definitely would like to have, when I'm hiring a mid-level archaeologist or even entry level, whether you have an MA or not, a lot of times the MA levels end up being entry level. And yes, I would prefer to have somebody that has more practical experience, but I end up training them anyway. I can't tell you how many MAs apply and expect that they're going to get the senior archaeologist position right off the bat. It happens all the time. It's really kind of crazy. Some disconnect in their MA programs is telling them that it's just an assumed position. And now they are, qualified to be a senior archaeologist, because there's so many other aspects. Now, first of all, we all know, even if we never went to graduate school, that in order to be a good CRM archaeologist, you have to have a lot of experience under your belt. And you're not going to get that by doing one thesis project or one dissertation project. You're just not going to get it. You don't have the perspective that you need of seeing for years, lots of different types of sites. You're just not going to have it yet. So, you had this myopic approach in graduate school, whether it be for MA or PhD, as a good starting point, but it certainly does not prepare you for being that lead archaeologist out in the field right off the bat. It requires, I assume that I have to train every single person that starts off with their company, whether they have a BA or an MA. I'm working with a little bit more if they have an MA, but maybe not. Maybe their attitude now is not so good because they think they know more than they really do. So I do wish that there was a little bit more practicality when it came to the graduate programs. And I sound like a broken record because, it's not just about digging. It's also about regulatory understanding. And that regulatory understanding absolutely, number one, affects where we dig probably more than anything else. But they're not learning that in school.
Yeah, that is a good way to bring it back, Heather. I was worried we were getting a little off track, but you're right though, that this is all part of it. A lot of this stems straight from your education, and that education could be grad school. That education could be the next company you work for, in learning all these little things on, where to dig, where to survey even, and what method to use for surveying for that matter, because all that really depends on Well, it depends on what are there for CRM, are there regulations you have to follow? Are there certain patterns and things that you simply just have to do because that's the way that agency or whatever says you're going to do it, right? You might think, well, I want to do it this way, but that's not how it works, right? You have to do it the way that they say you're going to do it on their land that they manage. So now you might be able to take some fancy new research study and say, yeah, but this says we could try this. Can we get away with that? And they might go ahead and okay that. But otherwise, it really does come down to the first, the regulations, and second, the cultural manifestations in that area, right? Like we talked about LiDAR down in Mesoamerica. Mm-hmm. Well, why do you do LiDAR down in Mesoamerica? Why don't we do 30-meter shovel test intervals in Mesoamerica? Because you simply can't walk through the jungle like that. Exactly. It's not possible. And this is an interesting question, though, because the cultures we tend to, quote, look for in Mesoamerica are building, monumental architecture, right? Like, where are the hunter-gatherer groups? They're there. They've been there 10, 15,000 years, just like here in the United States and Canada, so who's looking for those and how would you find those? That's something I don't even know the answer to because I don't have any experience working down there. And I've never really studied that area too much. And, just as much as the average person has probably seeing articles and things, but how do you find those older sites that are pre state level almost, and not even state level necessarily, but pre stone architecture kind of thing? How do you find those down there?
I did a second MA in GIS and was focused on predictive modeling. And, I think in those areas specifically, predictive modeling would be a really good, I've never worked in that area, but predictive modeling probably would be the best place to at least start, gleaning all the information that you can from the sites that you do know about, the hunter-gatherer sites you do know about, and then trying to apply that to the landscape and see, what you come up with. What are some areas that might have a better chance of finding a site? And then every time you find a site, you're able to, improve that model. And it just goes from there. But you have to have somebody who's willing to do that long term, or at least a few people signed on to do that. In California, I think necessity is the mother of invention, right? So, we are using LiDAR now. We're using LiDAR outside of these areas in Central America. And people are starting to use them like on the islands in Santa Barbara, Channel Islands, and in other areas. And then we have also, I use historic aerials a lot. Yeah. And looking at change and land use and what I can see over time. The historic aerials are really impressive. Now, obviously, it goes back to usually, the 1920s is the earliest that you can find, but it gives you an opportunity to see the land in some areas pristine, untouched, undeveloped yet, and gives you an opportunity to see, what might be there. We use GPR quite a bit. GPR is another way. I'm just kind of listing off, since we're talking about how do we know where to dig. There's lots of non-invasive strategies that can be used that we all know about, but I think that they beg mentioning.
The other thing that we're starting to use too is, working with communities and asking them where they would think there should be excavation, where there shouldn't be excavation. So there's, a bunch of places that are threatened because folks don't necessarily even know there's valuable resources there, or they don't really see those places as valuable. And, in the case of city neighborhoods where folks don't actually own those properties and they're not considered significant under the National Register, and the, developer, redevelopment organization, or whoever the heck is just going to go through that, kind of relying on the graciousness of the property owner and volunteers or university professors who will show up and do excavation before these places get torn down. I mean, that's how I ended up doing my PhD project, because there was no federal nexus and folks knew that this was a significant location, but nobody actually had done any testing or excavation anywhere near there. It was like in collaboration with folks who live in the city of Boise and archival records that we even put together that there were things before these buildings that we saw that were torn down. And also that this is an important place for folks who have just been overlooked by history in that town.
Yeah. Heather, as you were mentioning, and Bill too, that is one of the things that you do try to learn in, well, hopefully school, if not later on with further study and paying attention to articles and things. But like Heather mentioned, GPR, well, you can't use ground penetrating radar just anywhere, right? I mean, in places where there's, I believe it's like high water content and things like that in the soil, like a really wet soil, I don't think GPR works very well.
Correct.
You've got to use other methods, right? And there's, I think one of the best classes I took in my grad school at the University of Georgia was shallow geophysics. We spent over the summer, because I had to do 3 semesters there. And over the summer, we spent whatever length the class was. I think it was a month, but it was like every day, like an hour and a half or 2 hours every day for a month. We were on the cemetery at the University of Georgia at Athens, the cemetery that's like right on campus there. And there's buildings and stuff encroaching on it. And there's graves and plots that are just like falling off the side of the hill. And it's all craziness over there. And there's a lot of misplotted and forgotten graves out there. And so we used probably 7 or 8 different geophysical methods to try to locate graves. And some of them work better than others. And we would try to figure out, based on our knowledge of those, like, well, why didn't this one work very well versus this one versus another one, something like that, and see what kind of things the different results do. So, that's one of the ways that we end up knowing where to dig, so to speak, to round this out is we pay attention. We pay attention to the technology and what it can provide us. As we've said, LiDAR has been historically used in, high veg areas like Mesoamerica, but now it's being used in a lot of other places too, because we're just learning some newer techniques for it. It's getting cheaper for one thing,
right?
And easier to fly. You can fly it on drones now. So
share data.
Yep. Exactly. And you've got to stay abreast of those things to know what the current information is. So on that note, let's call it for now and come back on the other side and wrap up this topic on where to dig. Back in a second. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. All right, welcome back to episode 204 of the CRM Archaeology podcast. And we are talking about where to dig, reference the article in the show notes that I mentioned a few times now. So I don't think the article is anywhere close to where this discussion is, but at least prompted a discussion. So, there you go. And I think one thing we've noted throughout here is there is a big difference between academic versus CRM and where and how to dig and why you dig and things like that. The why, I think, is really the biggest difference. The where is probably largely the same, right? If you've got a big project area, whether you're academic or a CRM project, your where should be dictated by the things that were found on either a cursory recon or other sources of data. As we were starting to mention near the beginning, I think, Heather, you were talking about shared data sets. One thing somebody told me a number of years ago, somebody did a massive, intensive, I think it was a LiDAR survey of the Lake Tahoe area. So all around the rim, California, Nevada, and leading down the mountainsides from the rim of Lake Tahoe, there are free and accessible LiDAR data sets that are just like largely unanalyzed. They're just there. So very cool. That is super cool. And trying to find something like that, you could using aerial footage, aerial photographs, historic photographs, plat maps, things like that. You can come up with a pretty good research design and methodology without ever leaving your office these days. And it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I wanted to, we had alluded to it, or at least I alluded to it in the other segment, about how other entities, and we've mentioned a few times, tribal stakeholders, tribal groups are now definitely having a say in where and why and when we dig, as they should. And one aspect that's changed, in California, and that's the majority of my experience in California. So I'm curious if other states are different, but now it's getting to a point where they're frowning upon actually curation of artifacts. So now, we're not many times now, a lot of projects during the AB 52 consultation, tribal consultation, they're talking about how the artifacts are going to be handled after they're out of the ground. And sometimes it doesn't. So, that's going to, if we keep going down that road now, we're going to have fewer and fewer collections that end up in these curation facilities. And now the UC schools are now, and Bill can talk to that. UC schools are definitely having a different stance now on what they're going to allow in the schools and in their curation facilities. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that changes research designs not only for universities and for PhD students or graduate students, but also for how we handle things on a CRM end. I'm curious what Bill has to say about that.
I mean, yeah, you're right. And I work at Berkeley, which is connected to the Hearst Museum, which when it comes to NAGPRA, just go ahead and look it up. I don't really have to say anything more about that. But, the thing that's not really stated is that the anthropology department is doing a lot to try and work with tribes and be the, collaborator to get many things from the Hearst Museum repatriated. And, there's a million different ways that the museum has found new pathways to delay or prolong or procrastinate or whatever. But I don't work for the Hearst Museum, and I work for several people who they're just in a situation where whoever is the main administrators of that organization, they just don't want to repatriate NAGPRA items. But for a long time, I've known that previously UC professors would just go and get collections from around the world, and then they would stash them at the Hearst Museum. And it was just understood that, well, if you're a professor, you do that. Well, that's not how things are anymore. And I don't know when that started, but I don't know a single professor that hasn't had to have some kind of curation agreement, either in the community where they're working or with some other organization or state repositories before they excavate. And so that's kind of already been the thing, at least at UC Berkeley, that if you go and dig stuff up, you got to figure out where it's going to go before you even start excavating, because the Hearst doesn't take archaeology professors' collections. Now, I don't know. There might be some professors that are just so good they can get them to take them. But I mean, in my case, I always try to find some kind of curation facility that's actually in the community where I'm working. And I because I did cultural resources for so long, I'm most interested in things going to the state repositories because they're already set up for that. But if you're doing work in an area where they don't have any room in the state repository, I don't know where that would go, right? Like, I don't know. And also if you're in a state where they don't accept things from private property in non-CRM excavations, I don't know what you would do with your things if you dug something on private property for a dissertation. I mean, would it just go back to the farm owner, or, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or it gets, well, in many cases, projects I'm on, we're actually putting them back in the ground where they are. I mean, part of the curation agreement is non-curation. It's curation back in the ground. I was actually referring to, this it was kind of a controversy a few months ago where it came out that the UC schools are starting to limit what they're going to allow in the curation as far as curation of Native American artifacts, collections. So that was kind of what I was referring to. But I do think that over time now, just a lot of the AB 52 consultation I'm seeing, I can definitely see we're starting to change how we're going to curate, and which will then obviously should change how we do research.
Yeah. And just to let people know, this is all tied up in the why, right? Mm-hmm. The why we dig, like you said, Heather, in the very beginning, sometimes there's good reasons to not dig. And if if there's no reason to right now, like if it's not under imminent threat or danger, then you're better off just not digging and not having to worry about where to put all this stuff. Right. And then, like you guys were saying, and Bill, you were alluding to this for California, man, the robotic nature of some agencies sometimes. Like I was renewing my California BLM permit, I think a year ago or something like that. And I had let it expire because it had been years since I'd had a project there that I was in charge of. I was on other people's permits, but I didn't need one myself. And so I let it expire, which means my curation agreement's expired, because to get the cultural resources use permit, you need to have a curation agreement in place. And they don't care where. Like, this is for the BLM in California, one of the biggest states in the entire country, and they don't care where your curation agreement is. All they care about is that you have one. And I think the one I had before was down in Santa Barbara or something like that. And they were no longer taking curation agreements. So I had to find something else. And I think it ended up being the Matarango Museum in Ridgecrest, California, of all places. But why would they take artifacts from, some project up in Lassen County? You know what I mean? Up in northeastern California. But that's exactly where that stuff would go if I had actually found anything. And then back to the robotic nature of it, because of the size of my CRM firm, I actually I don't take any projects where I actually have to collect artifacts, right? Like, I'm not going to do an excavation. I don't have a lab.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't do shovel testing because you keep everything in the shovel test typically. And I just don't have a way to process and deal with that stuff that's cost effective for me at this level. So I do pedestrian surveys and other things that, typically it's no collect. So I wish I could have just said, well, I'm only going to do, can I get a no collect cultural resources use permit or CRUP? And no, sure, they say that when you get your fieldwork authorization, no collect if there's nothing in there, but it's just irritating.
I wonder why tribal groups aren't creating their own curation facilities. That's something that,
it all comes down to money, right?
It does, but we have, especially the federally recognized that have casinos.
Yeah.
They have the resources to do that.
But do you think that would encourage more excavation, where most tribal groups that I'm aware of would just rather you left it alone and they want that stuff to stay buried and in the ground? But if they have a curation facility, that implies maybe a tacit agreement that it's okay to excavate and keep the stuff? Because I don't think they want their ancestors' artifacts or human remains or anything like that anywhere near them in a lot of cases.
I think that's a really good point. But I think, I've actually spoken to a few cultural resource managers in California for tribal groups. And, just because of the fact that we have so many collections that are sitting in these repositories, just collecting dust, that, this wouldn't be a curation facility for the end to be, continually filling it up, but that it would take care of what is there, what does exist now. And in the few cases where reburial isn't possible,
Mm-hmm.
and then it wouldn't, require a large area. But I think it should go back to the tribes. It should go back to origin and allow them to handle the way they see fit.
Well, then the key there is to make sure that they're part of the whole planning process, because if, like you mentioned before, if the testing shows that there's a significant site there, then I'm quite sure many tribes would say, okay, well, then that area is now not a place where we're going to go. So, redesign your whole project, because we don't want to curate things and we don't want to have things or anything. Just don't dig them up.
Well, the thing is, though, they don't have the way the consultation process is doesn't preclude development. It doesn't mean because they say they don't want development that's the hard line.
Right.
For some, it's, unfortunately, that's the case. It's, as far as AB 52, they just have the developer or the agencies just has to make a good faith effort to come to an agreement. And that's it. Doesn't mean that they have to have an agreement. They just have to make a good faith effort to have come to an agreement. And many times because of that, the development, goes on regardless of what the tribes say.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
And I think that's how the whole laws work, basically, any which way, it sounds like.
Here on the East Coast, as I mentioned, you can get some really deeply buried sites, and typical stratigraphy is if you go deeper, you're getting older. And a lot of times I guess, lack of a better way to say it, the archaic component is not excavated at all, because you're talking, 1 to 5, 6 meters deep in the sand occasionally. But one of the strategies for dealing with that is, we would go through and do a shovel testing survey, maybe even do excavation on the top meter, maybe a little more, but the top meter and a half, and get all the, basically preserve through excavation, if that's a way to say it, at least the artifacts and stratigraphy and positional data of all the things that we're excavating there, including features and things like that. We would get that for those things. And that's typically as deep as you need to go for even a large building. A typical example out here in the Southeast is a Walmart. There's a Walmart in every corner, but they're going to put a huge cement slab down, a whole bunch of gravel, a huge cement slab, and then, a billion-ton building right on top of it. So, but that preserves the archaic component, and it preserves it in a way that, scientists aren't necessarily happy with, because we want to dig it all up and learn from it. But Native Americans are happy with it because it stays in the ground, it stays in position, it's unmodified, it's not messed with. You know what I mean? And that is a good mitigation strategy sometimes, is to just cover with a road, cover with a building, something like that, as long as you're not digging into it and destroying it.
Yeah, or minimize impacts with, something like caissons, pilings, and just changing the design of the building itself.
The problem with doing something like that, like capping and stuff like that, is that eventually people forget that that's what's there. And there is a strong trend in archaeology where, well, if there's a building there, it's clearly disturbed. Despite the fact we all know that's not the case, right? Like, I don't know if there's actually any data to back it up, but there is constantly the concern that doing things like capping basically is going to encourage the destruction of whatever got capped, because along the lines, someone's going to have to, do a modification or a renewal or something of a project. And because it got approved in the first case, that whatever they want to do just automatically gets approved. And then they go ahead and, tear out whatever they were supposedly protecting in the first place.
That's a good point.
I don't actually, like I say, I don't actually know of any specific examples of that happening. And so maybe that's just like fear mongering, right? Like that's the concern. That's like Tom King's concern with flag and avoid, is eventually the flags go away. And how do you know to keep avoiding it? Right.
Yeah.
In California, every time you want to dig, whether you've had an investigation there or not, typically the agencies are requiring another investigation on modification, of anything that's going to have ground disturbance. Now, obviously, other states are not as stringent as California, but in California, we do that all the time, where we have modifications to properties that have already been investigated, and they have to go through the whole process all over again.
Yeah.
The other, as far as capping goes, when you do cap, at least in California, we still have to do some kind of data recovery. When we have a site and we do capping, now, if you're doing capping and you don't even know you have a site there, that's one thing. But if you know you have a site and you're preserving it, you still have to glean some of the information. We still have to do some data recovery in that area so that information or the data is not lost altogether. So
that's interesting. Yeah. Why is that?
For that reason, because when you cap a site, the idea is that you're avoiding it, and you're avoiding it forever. And if you have a site there that could contribute to the understanding of either history or prehistory, you have a responsibility to get the information before it's capped and never touched again. So when we do capping, we still have to do some data recovery. It's not as on a large scale as if it was being destroyed, but we still do need to do some data recovery.
Well, on that note, we're going to try to recover the rest of the data from this article at some other date and time. So, no, I think we did
about your.
I haven't hit it yet. Yeah, I know. So anyway, as you can tell, we're just scratching the surface on all this, and your methods for, why and where you dig are different everywhere. And maybe if you're meeting up with family this holiday season, hopefully not too much, #COVID. But if somebody says, what do you do? I'm an archaeologist. What does that mean? How do you guys know what to do? Send them this episode 204 of the CRM Arc podcast. Maybe that will probably generate many more questions, but that's kind of the whole point, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I think this is a good discussion. And one of the things we found out while doing this, of course, as we always do, is there's not a solid answer. Things are different everywhere you go. And Heather, you work in Southern California. There's in Southern California alone, you've got coastal, mountains, desert, city, all kinds of stuff. And the methods vary depending on where you're at and who you're working with and what the cultural habits and what they did were. So, and what you're looking for too, is it historic, is it prehistoric? So anyway, thank you guys for your insights on this article and how we do these things in various parts of the country. And if you want to let us know as the listener how you guys do things, send us an email. Our contact information is in the show notes, or you can comment wherever you found this podcast. That's it, and we'll see you next time. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArcPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Happy holidays, everyone.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.